Yeah. So firstly, thank you so much again. Ayush, for getting me here. I mean, just like it's a fantastic sort of thing that you're doing, and just it's quite a privilege for me, and I'm sure everybody else, whoever is contributing to this project. And yeah, we just pitching in whatever little I can do. So just to give you all a short introduction of what I'm doing here. So I'm doing a graduate course in politics here at Oxford, particularly in political thought and political theory. So I work primarily on the history of ideas, certain ideas, the concepts that we take for granted. For example, religion, state, political parties, etc. And I think the reason that this I particularly chose this reading group to be around the short sort of dialogue was that Socrates, oh sorry, Plato, is the introduction to not just philosophy but to the entire process of academic thinking. So I think for students who are not um, in an institutional context where they are given the training to interpret and critically analyze texts, I think it's very important for them to have a form of introduction to any Platonic dialogue, because that opens up an entire world to them. There's everything. So there's A.N. Whitehead, very famously said once, which has sort of become a cliche now, that all of Western political thought, Western tradition of thinking, is just a series of footnotes to Plato. And I dare say it's not just the Western thinking, but also all of us here. Let's not forget that North India for a long time, especially Punjab, was part of the Hellenistic world. For centuries, Greek was the official court language, and also during the Middle Ages, when Europe lost all texts on Plato. So, for example, Plato wrote at least 28 dialogues that we are aware of survived, and of them, only one was known in the early sort of modern Europe, I think, for centuries. So they had lost all these dialogues in the public sort of domain, and the only people who were commenting on Aristotle and Plato were the Arab scholars in Baghdad in the Middle East, and which then later came into India. Then, so that there is a form of collective universal knowledge here, and if whoever has read this would sort of feel the same thing, which is when you read a dialogue of Plato, despite all the cultural differences and the contextual differences, between our culture and theirs, there's something deeply universal about it. Like, you can feel, there's certain like instances where I can just like feel the character of the dialogue making sense that you can relate to, right? And that relatedness is not an accident, right? It means that there's something about you know particularly Plato and Aristotle that has survived all basically cultural contexts, and we can all relate to them. So that's basically that. So just to give you a brief sort of introduction historically, which is you can do this better on Wikipedia, just to like give a broad like historical overview of why Plato is particularly that important. And the reason Plato is that important is not particularly because of Plato, but because of his mentor named Socrates, who himself wrote nothing, but at least in antiquity brought an intellectual revolution that was frankly unheard of before. So Socrates was a thinker, a form of a philosopher. He used to just like roam around all the time in Athens, which was the main city state. And he had served in the army before, which I think was evident in the dialogue if you read it. With one of the generals, I think it was Laches or Nicias, one of them. And Socrates, amongst all his accomplishments, the main thing was, I think, the main sort of accomplishment, intellectually speaking, was that he was primarily the first thinker in the world, not in the world, at least in the classical period, to frame the question of philosophy to the question of what is a good action, just to put it colloquially, right? What's the right thing to do for me? It's a very selfish question to ask. But before that, metaphysical, broader questions were, trying to understand the natural world, blah, blah, blah. Which, Socrates was the first person in that respect, right? In that intellectual context, to frame the entire purpose of thinking around our ethical sort of conduct. And that's a huge deal, right? Which meant that, if I can decide what I can do, therefore there's a form of not just autonomy, but also responsibility, ethically speaking, that I have as an individual. right? Which is not, I'm not just part of this social system where I'm just blindly following custom. And he had to pay for this, with his life. So, the Athenian democracy, um, uh, you know, uh, found him guilty of on two grounds. One was, misleading the youth of the city of Athens, and second was, I think, denigrating the gods. And this was heresy basically, and he was forced to commit suicide after that. Just like this famous sort of tragic moment. But unlike again the ancient world where heroism was considered a part of, let's say, fighting a war or a battle, you know, Socrates is courage in that respect, what we can now call like academic, whatever, intellectual freedom, was not like, he wasn't fighting war, but he's just like committing himself to certain ideas, which now we take for granted, right? So in the modern world, we have deep religious convictions, we have deep moral, whatever convictions for which sometimes we are ready to take our own lives. But so Socrates was that grand figure. And, we know everything about Socrates because of his student, Plato, who was himself an aristocrat who lived after lived after Socrates, sorry, and wrote these fantastic dialogues, which are literally they're beautifully written. But at the same time, there's basically everything there, right? So maybe it's not an actual like historical representation of Socrates, but the character of Socrates reveals a lot. So, I mean, all main questions about you know the world, basically, about politics, ethics, epistemology, even later like physics and metaphysics, uh, all forms of like understanding the natural world, biology, which was taken up by Aristotle. I mean, these disciplines that we take for granted, or these subjects that we take for granted now, were sort of questions that were explored by Plato and his then student Aristotle, who, took this entire thing ahead. So this is a very historically important sort of thinker. Um, and if you want to, I would say, generally engage with humanities, I think this is the best place to start. This is what people have done for the last 2,000 years, and with all humility, I think we should also do the same. So the main thing that I want to emphasize on before I move forward is why, again, I shared this shorter dialogue. Number one, I shared it because I like it, so I imposed this on all of the people who were forced to read this. But secondly, this is one of what they call an early dialogue of Plato. So this is when Plato was a bit young, which is around his 30s. And Laches was a dialogue which is, I think now they called it the virtue dialogue, which is that it was framed around one virtue. So there's certain Euthyphro and blah blah blah. There are like lots of other these shorter dialogues that are like few pages long, and they just revolve around one virtue. So there's one on holiness, there's one on this, and Laches is on courage, right? And before again I move forward, this is also an important sort of thing to also consider. Despite my point about this stuff being universal, we also have to take into account sort of the cultural specificity of the text. So the English translation says courage, right? And this dialogue is about courage, right? So what is courage? What's the virtue of courage? But the Greek word for this was Andrea, right? And Andrea sort of translates into, I would say, manliness more than courage, right? It sort of means literally like it's a personal quality that a Athenian gentleman ought to have possessed, right? So manliness meant like you were doing well in battle, right? You were traditionally expected to be like a gentleman who could rule the city as an aristocrat, etc. So it's a very masculine quality. So that is like etymologically too, sort of Andrea also comes from. So the Greek word for man is aner, but is also anthropos. So so there's like a similarity. Just like our languages, I'd say Punjabi, Urdu, Hindi, even Nepali, if I can presume. Like these are gender languages, right? So certain nouns and adjectives they have a certain gender. So the very sort of this adjective of courage or noun, was a masculine sort of characteristic, right? It was a deeply like male, manly thing to do. So that's that, right? So just to bring that into focus. But despite again the subjects of the dialogue being a quality that, or like a virtue that was a very Greek thing, right? Very like pre-modern thing. Like we now don't associate manliness, right, as a positive thing, right? There's something negative about it. But despite, the dialogue being framed about around like an archaic sort of virtue that no longer is with us, the reason this dialogue and generally Plato is very important is not, um, you would say, the conclusions that it leads us to, but all the process, right, which is now called the Socratic method. The Socratic method, which is again the foundation stone of modern academic thinking, is basically what you would have heard as critical thinking. Basically, right? You ask questions, right? So you don't start a priori from like, this is the universal truth, therefore this is the conclusion I'm drawing, but rather you test every argument on the basis of questioning, right? On the basis of critical thinking or logical reasoning, and you test every argument to its very end, right? So if an argument is leading nowhere, that's it. We need to discard it. And this is the central sort of intellectual method that's employed everywhere in the world, including here at Oxford or in Ashoka, everywhere, right? So whoever wants to, let's say, think properly in an academic context in a university, you know, the main sort of inspiration that most of these, no matter what subject you're doing, that they employ is this, right? And therefore, Plato is so important in that respect. So what I basically wanted to do was, force people who are on call to sort of think about the dialogue with me. But I can empathize because I also attend a lot of classes without doing a reading. So I've been told now I have to give a lecture, like it's just a small one. So I won't do that. But what I'm going to do is basically summarize, right? And what I'll try to do by doing this, and this is again the assumption of what follows is that you've read the thing, which is not that long, basically just like 10-15 pages. If you can just give it a skim, it's not even that difficult. It's one of the more I've seen easier dialogues to read of all Plato's sort of dialogues, and it's also the most fantastically good one because it reveals a lot of like central themes that become so important to later Platonic works. So what I'll do now is, at least in the next 15-20 minutes, like quickly go through the dialogue, right? And what I want to show you, like whoever is like listening to this, any student in school, is how people who read this in a university think, right? So somebody who's, let's say, doing a graduate course anywhere in a good university in the world, who's forced to read this thing, right? I want to reveal like the mental process, right? And that there's a certain way of reading these texts. You just can't skim through them. Like there's a way of interpreting and understanding, and then sort of taking out the gist of the argument, which I just want to show. So this is going to be a display of sorts of a, rather like a bad reading of Plato, because let me also emphasize that I'm just, the difference between you and me just is just few years. So, I'm not any scholar here who has a last word in this. Just don't take whatever I say, as a literal sort of truth. Just let me preface that by saying that this is just again one reading of Plato, however bad it is. So don't quote me on this. But again, the method is what matters, not the end product. So, all right. So when we open the dialogue, right, like most Platonic dialogues, it opens up as Lysimachus, who's a guy who wants to basically get his son's uh, mentored, and he's looking for a tutor, right? So this is sort of the preface of the dialogue. So the context. So the problem, so there's like a long sort of first dialogue of Lysimachus, which goes on. By the way, should I close the window in case there's a lot of noise coming in?
No, I can hear you fine. That's good.
You sure? Because there's a lot of traffic right outside. Hope it's
No, no,
okay.
no, no. It's good. It's good.
Okay, it's okay. So like Lysimachus, right, comes to watch like a display of sorts of these armored. So there's called like an armory display. Basically, guys who wear armors and do sword fighting. And he wants to see, whether that's a good way of training his sons. Now, this was time, by the way, when schools did not exist, so they did not have a curriculum. So there was Despite having, the extraordinary freedom of choosing whatever education you could, you also had the extraordinary burden of having to do the right thing, right? Because there wasn't as if you had to give a CBSE board exam or sorts. Like there was no curriculum in that respect that was in that, again, pre-modern society, which was set in stone. You had to say find your own curriculum, and that meant that if you messed up in that making that decision, the consequences could have been disastrous for you, right? They could have learned nothing. So a lot of these, like early schools in Athens, for example, the sophists, or even the one that Plato and Aristotle later founded, it's called, I think the one that Aristotle founded was called the academy, from where we get the word academy for academia. They had their own way of teaching things, right? So they had their own curriculum. Is very independent in that respect. And so the problem is here, like again, what opens up the dialogue is that Lysimachus is saying that, look, my, our fathers were, generals. They did really well, but in their commitment to public service, they did not look after us, right? So we are nobodies, and if we don't want to commit the same mistake again, and therefore it sort of opens up again for an ancient reader. It would really hit a very raw nerve, which is to say that, look, you can do well in life because, again, in that cultural context, Athens and ancient Greek for that matter was a very competitive society. Doing well, right, becoming like a good general or whatever it was, or maybe a good like speaker, aristocrat, was considered as the ideal form of life. And the point here is that, look, if you just focus on yourself, chances are if you don't look after your children, they'll suffer, right? So so the opening is the big problem. All right, so the problem of parenting is the central sort of theme around which this dialogue would revolve around, right? Which obviously comes to education. So he goes to these two guys. One is Nicias, one is Laches. They're both generals. They're being generals, and these were, so think about like Plato's characters is that they're based on true people, like sort of real people in like historical persons. So both of them had served. I think one of them, I think it was Nicias, who during the Peloponnesian War was the general who led that Athenian army to Syracuse, which is modern Sicily. So the Peloponnesian War, when this in Plato's time and also Socrates' time, was this 30-year long war between Sparta and Athens, right? And Sparta won eventually, and they won because Athens lost this very bad battle, right? The siege of some sorts in modern day Sicily, and that's when Athens sort of collapsed after that. And this guy was basically there, and I think he died. So Plato takes inspiration and bases his like character on him. Laches, I think, is also was a general. I think he was one that served with Socrates, like in like historical real terms, with Socrates in one of the early sort of engagements that they had with other city states. So he goes to these two people, and look. So the question that they direct, so these two small sort of speeches by Nicias and Laches, right? The question that you know Lysimachus again poses for the other his this friend is that what's the best sort of training that I can give my sons, right, for my children, basically. And again, this is a very patriarchal society. There's no consideration for a daughter here, but we can like now generalize it, saying, "Okay, what's the best education for the children, generally speaking?" And so for Nicias, right, he gives a general answer. He says that, look, it can have two elements like this. So there's a big sort of speech that he gives initially at the dialogue, where he said that, look, basically there are 2 points. One is that you can do this armor training. So they're watching the display where people are showing off certain skills and what we could now call like sword fighting. So there's certain Greek words for this. Again, they're very hard to translate in English. And, you know, you can learn that, Nikia says, because when you 1-to-1 in a battle, when the sort of formation falls, you have to face the enemy 1-to-1, and if you know how to do sword fighting, you can survive and you can kill the enemy, right? But at the same time, you can't just learn how to the skill with sword. You also need like the intellectual skill, right? Just strategy, which makes you a general. So his thing is that, look, if you want to train your kids in like as in military warfare, train them with sword fighting and also give them like some strategic education. So that's the most obvious thing that would arise as an answer to anybody if you ask them in the first place, right? What's the best way to train military sort of people? Is these two qualities. So then Lackey sort of interjects, right? So his thing is, he, instead of giving an answer, and this is again the second big sort of paragraph, in the dialogue, Lackey says, look, we first have to ask whether this sword fighting is a skill in itself or not. And this opens up this huge sort of central theme in Plato's dialogues, which is that, is a certain skill a skill in itself, right? And this is again a very central theme that occurs on and on in all of Plato's dialogues. So there's another dialogue called Gorgias, where the main question again is whether what we today call debating, right? Is it genuinely a skill, or is it just like, basically some form of, now sophistry has become a bad negative word today, but at that time it was like a positive term. But it is some sort of a fake thing, right? Where you just like learn how to persuade people. It's not philosophy, right? Where there's an end good that you're chasing. There's no central virtue to, let's say, debating or sophistry. The same applies here, right? So this Lackey, even though he's making his own point, again, when somebody reads here as a graduate student or somebody who's doing classics, the point is to read under the sort of lines, right? So the reason Plato has put this dialogue here is to not just make a character of Laches, is also like through the character of Laches make his own argument, right? Or like somehow hint at his own argument, right? Which would later become more evident. And then 184e, which is like the number of the dialogues in the general citations of all dialogues. There's a Socrates as being called, like, and this is one of the rare dialogues where Socrates is actually respected by his interlocutors. Generally speaking, he's very much despised. They get to very bad, ugly arguments. But here they just like respectfully call him, they're like, this is a very smart person. We should ask him what he thinks about this. And then Socrates comes and says, and I quote here, is like this citation number 184e, is like, decisions uh, knowledge ought to make decisions, not majority rule, right? So there's, after these dialogues, there's like a conversation that they have. So Socrates, he asks him that, let's say if two of you agree and I disagree, just because two of you agree, would the two versus one mean that your thinking is legitimate or not? Like, or your way of thinking is justified or not? So this is again, this like opens up again. The reason I'm emphasizing on this particular part is like, a student who may not be aware will just skim through this, but this like short dialogue reveals a lot, right? Which is like the general skepticism that Plato had for democracy, which was basically that, look, just because a majority agrees on a certain thing doesn't mean it's true, right? The truth has to be sort of excavated through knowledge or some form of logical exercise. And if one person knows the truth, if the 99 others agree on certain thing, you know, the one person who actually has the access to truth is the correct one, right? And this was, again, Athens was a democracy, and this was a very heretical thing to say, right? It was a very dangerous thing to say. And Socrates again had to pay for his life because of this, right? Because he was a big, again, critical democracy, at least the former democracy that Athens had back then, which was a former majoritarian assembly, basically. So again, Socrates again makes that intervention. It's not the main part of the dialogue. It's just like there. But again, this is a very important piece. Again, there's like one sentence embedded there that you may skim through, but it's a central theme of Plato throughout. And then we basically, come to the alternative. So Socrates then frames the question in a different way. He says, before you ask a question of what is the best way of education, right, for your kids, let's just ask, right, what's education in the first place? He said, it's a form of study of the soul of young men, right? So like he frames the question in a more profound way. He said, look, it's not just about giving you the right training to do battle and stuff. Like there's something deeper about it, more profound. It's like, you have to train your internal character in a certain sense. The stakes are way higher. And again, so then he says that, look, for the purpose of military action, we have to ask what virtue counts, right? What's the virtue that you're looking for? And once we recognize that, what's the best way in order to cultivate that virtue in a child, in a student, through the form of education? So instead of just saying that, oh, you want to be a good general in life, so do X and Y, we have to first ask, all right, what's the virtue that makes a good general a good general? And then we have to ask ourselves, all right, what's the best way as a form of education we can instill that virtue in that child? Now, this may seem like a simple question, but again, it's quite a complicated one, as we would, find out later. So, look, there are three big responses. I'll just focus on two, and I'll focus on the Laches one because the third one, it's more complicated and it's supposed to be that. So I'll just skim through the third one later. So there are two definitions of courage, right, that the dialogue provides mainly, and it's through the character of Laches, right. So the first is to defend himself. So this is to defend oneself without running away, right? So if you are courageous, if you don't run away from a fight. Now, this is the most intuitive, I would say, definition of courage that we also may think about it. So just ask yourself a question: if you were to define courage, right, in the context of military warfare, or just the courage in terms of you fighting with somebody, like that would be courageous, right? You're just not running away. You're standing your ground even if you're getting beat up. We call that courageous. We still do, despite like 2,000 years of cultural difference that we have from Plato. But it's a very, like, again, it's a very intuitive psychological response across cultural context that every human being has. So this is, what so Plato begins with. And this is again the theme of every dialogue: is the first response is always the most intuitive one. And then Plato then breaks it down with reasoning and logic. So the first response, the reason, Socrates thinks that the character of Socrates thinks that this is basically used nonsense, is that what we want is a general account, right? This is so Socrates says that, look, this is so specific, and he gives examples of, look, there are cases where, strategically speaking, there's some warriors. He quotes Scythians, who were like these nomadic sort of warriors in Central Asia, who were a lot of time battling Greeks and sort of in that period of time. Scythians also took over North India for a long time. They later became Kushans, and these are the guys who again brought Greek in North India after the Bactrians. So Scythians were at that point of time is sort of like Mongolian sort of people, Turkic nomadic sort of people who were roaming around, and the way they used to battle was that they used to cavalry charge, and then while retreating, they used to, like, for example, you know, throw a barrage of arrows, etc. So there's a strategic way of fighting where the retreat itself, right? Even if you're fighting, you're running away. By running away, you're drawing the enemy, and then you're just killing them, right? So Socrates says that, look, by your definition, this would be cowardly, but they're doing it intentionally. So that means your definition is too specific, right? We need a more general account for courage, which can not just uh, account for a situation where you're standing your ground and not running away, but also these cases, right, where, again, in today's lots of warfare, you have, you should know this, strategic retreat, right? Military sort of strategy. You're retreating in a certain way where you're drawing the enemy again. You're not doing it because you're a coward. You're doing it because you're smart. So Socrates says that, look, this definition of yours is, frankly, is nonsense. It's too specific. And then Laches then gets a second definition, which again is very intuitive if you think about it. He says, like, look, it's the endurance of the soul, right? In the sense that, if I can endure a lot of pain, basically, that means I'm courageous, right? And again, if you think about it, before I go into the criticism, it's a very intuitive thing. And this is the thing about, Plato's dialogue again. Like, despite our cultural differences, there's something deeply psychologically human about this that we can all relate to. Now, if you think about it, in a lot of contexts, we would call endurance courageous. So, for example, if a student, as a kid, right, who's wants to get into a particular college or university, wants to get a particular score in an exam, or let's say wants to get into a particular university, gets rejected once, doesn't back down, gets rejected again, doesn't back down, and keeps on going, going, finally gets accepted. You would call that courage in a certain way, right? There's an element of endurance. And again, endurance here is a more general word in ancient Greek. Like, the English translation again doesn't capture the entire concept properly. Endurance here is the capacity to endure suffering in a certain sense, right? Pain, basically. So if I can endure a lot of pain, like whatever, physical or like emotional, and still keep on going for my target, right? That means I have guts, right? I'm courageous. So that's the second definition. So Socrates also, like, calls, this nonsense by basically saying that, look, you know, endurance can also be a foolish form of endurance, right? So, you know, there's so many cases where, like, people, what we in Hindi we call them dheet, right? It's like they don't change. They're too stubborn. So endurance can also be a form of stubbornness, which is not a good thing, right? So, for example, a person like a donkey basically is just doing the same thing again and again without reaping good results, and and is not willing to change his actions. You would call that foolishness, right? In a certain sense. Or if, like, you can also, for example, argue that a guy who's a thief works on his craft really well, right? Endures a lot of, sometimes, tragedies when he's caught and goes to jail, and yet, he's perfecting his craft. So he's enduring, but he's enduring it for something which is really, really bad, which is like robbing people, for example. So he says that, look, endurance can be also foolish. So there has to be something more than endurance. Like, it has to be attached to some form of virtue, right? So that's what's the good form of endurance. So here, so there are two things here. What Socrates are. For the first one, right? If somebody, again, when you read these texts, this is how you have to interpret them. The logical sort of reasoning that is employed in the dialogue. Again, I'm highly simplifying this. Let me just also emphasize that. The first one, Socrates is saying that, look, when you define courage as a form of not running away, that's too specific, right? So his definition is being challenged on the grounds of being very, like, constrained, right? So it's a definitional challenge in that respect, right? So he then distinguishes and says that you need a generalizing count. Whereas for the second one, right, uh, he says that, look, again, he's drawing distinctions, right? He's saying that, look, you're unlike the previous response, the number one, where you just don't run away, which is supposed to be too specific and account to count as a definition. The second one is too general in a certain sense, right? Because it's not capturing distinctions. So endurance by itself, is not a bad or good thing. What matters is how is that endurance being used, right? So there's a distinction being drawn between good and bad, and therefore this definition is too general, unlike the first one, which is too specific. So this is like the conceptual sort of challenge that, there's deep inside, not deep inside, just right there in front of you, in the dialogue. And then the third one is Nicias, and I'm not going to go into this because, look, there's a historical sort of thing about this. Nicias is basically, in my view, again, I may be entirely wrong on this, just like a caricature of a sophist, right? And for that reason, Plato just put some nonsense in his mouth, which Laches and everybody else also says, what the hell are you talking about? Because it's so complicated. So his account is that, look, courage is a form of wisdom, which, or a knowledge of fearful and hopeful, of everything in a situation. So, like, such a, it doesn't mean anything in a certain sense, right? And just like Socrates then just calls this not, he says that, look, this is also very general, it can mean anything, right? It can mean, you, by this definition, for example, you can just call this like virtue in itself, right? It's not courage. So the courage here is a part of a bigger thing which he calls virtue, right? And virtue is the most central sort of concept that works around it, right? So you can have, there's a general virtue, right? This is the general sort of concept, and then there's subdivisions. Like, there are different forms of virtues that are applied to different contexts or different actions. Courage is a certain virtue that's applied in this form. And so Socrates' point is that, look, your definition is also so general. Like, unlike Laches, you're not just like defining courage, like over defining it. You're just like defining basically virtue, right? It's not helping me with anything in trying to like pinpoint what particularly courage is as a sub sort of category. This is the thing. Like, this is like a very basic, again, just. And then the dialogue ends. And this is also, again, just to end this entire thing. Let me also emphasize that, most of the dialogues end with what the Greeks used to call aporia. Now, aporia basically means a situation where, how to explain this? It's a situation where it's not a disagreement, but there's no agreement, right? It's a situation where, like, ideas just don't coalesce together into conclusion. So you have a conversation without reaching an agreement, right? So there's no agreement in the end. And the point here is very, very important, like the underlying sort of logic of this, is that in all of Plato's dialogues, almost all of them, the point is not that Socrates has an answer to every answer. He's just like, his only, the reason Socrates is considered to be smart is that at least he knows nothing, right? So there's that intellectual humility, which is again so important for the conduct of a like an academic, that I don't know anything, but what I do know is this Socratic sort of reasoning method or logical critical thinking, and I can employ that to like diffuse any idea, right? So the point here is not that Socrates has inner wisdom to every question in the world. Is that Socrates is shutting up people who pretend that they do, right? So people who think that they can define courage, who themselves are generals, who are very accomplished, themselves are not sure what courage is, right? And that's the point of this dialogue and all of basically Plato's dialogues, is that there's no like one answer at all. What matters is what's the process, right, by which you come to your answer. And if you have an answer which can sustain itself against critique all the time, then good for you, right? That means you just have clarity, right? You have knowledge, which is a good thing. But it doesn't make you like a superior being or anything else. So again, so this is why for all these qualities, Plato is this so central to academic thinking for the last 2000 years at least. This is why most of the things that we take for granted when we think about as a critical thinking and analyzing concepts, definitions, blah blah blah, arguments, like all the logical structure that we construct when we do humanity or social sciences. It's just like it all begins here, right? And this is a very good introduction for anybody who's in school, frankly, to see how your mind should work, right? So because unlike most philosophers of after Plato, who just like gave you like a text, right? This is the question, this is the answer. Whereas here, like he's not even posing the one question, and he's not even giving the answer. What he's giving you is, or revealing you, in fact, is a method of thinking, right? And that's so important to whatever we have today. So that's all. This is where I end. I think I've spoken a bit too much for one person. So that'll be it. Thank you.
No, that was really, really impressive, Gurmat. Like to say all of that in such simple terms. I mean, like, like we were reading about how like these authors do use a lot of jargon when talking, and you have no jargon. You just say so crisply like everything that Plato's talking about. I really, really enjoyed that.
So sweet
I
of
mean,
you. Thank you.
for our first lecture, Gurmat, not gonna lie, it's pretty,
Huh?
pretty. Yeah, I'm impressed. Was
Yeah, you
anyone
were
have
impressed,
any
and I'm very good.
that they want to share with Gurmat or with the rest of the call? Sarahana, what
Sorry,
are you thinking
sorry.
about? Sorry.
Sorry, there's an ambulance here. Can you say that
Oh,
again? Sorry, sorry. Sunani,
I
no.
was just asking if anyone had any thoughts that they wanted to contribute to the call.
I think nobody
Sarana?
wants to talk.
Yeah, maybe if we.
Yeah, hi. Hello.
Yes, Sarana.
Yeah,
What did
you were
you?
listening to this. So sweet of you. I thought I was just talking to you like you.
Yeah, I'll be honest, I did miss out on a few things in the middle because it was really like sort of complicated. Because it's a lot about ideologies and endurance, and there's a very thin line between, what you would call brave and what you would call foolishly brave. So
Yeah, yeah.
that's a very new concept that I learned, and that's one of the first things that will stay with me from this seminar.
Yeah, it's like that's a good sort of learning to have. Thank you for this. But I would just generally say that, look, again, don't listen to what I have said. Again, just like I'm just like you guys. I just like read a bit more because I've had more time in this world. But just read this yourself. And generally, again, so here at Oxford, for example, I'll tell you, we have this thing called the Plato Reading Group. So a lot of classic scholars conduct this, and there's a professor named Teresa Pajan. She's a professor of political theory here at Oxford. She works a lot on the history of political thought, and she conducts this thing. And it's a very fascinating exercise where throughout the term we just take this one dialogue. There are 30, 40 people in the room, by the way. Some of them like graduate students, some of them undergrads who haven't read this thing before at all, don't know ancient Greek again. And I must also say, like, I'm just like still learning the languages, so my knowledge of that is also very like basic, very introductory. And we just like sit together, we just go through each dialogue slowly, So one term is just for one dialogue. So right, so if on each sitting we just read one page, and then we slowly discuss every sentence. And in that, you can draw so many interpretations. So the reason certain texts survive for thousands of years is that there's a lot in them, right? So when you approach them with a some sense of humility, and it helps you with any subject, right? So the thing about the classical authors is that no matter if you're doing law, or economy, or politics, right? There's something in there that's important, and I think particularly again, and it's not I'm not saying that you go to become like a scholar in classics or anything else, but or a philosopher for that matter. But no matter what you want to do later in life, even if it's like something more practical, your education, at least while you're in school or high school, you should. I think I really think that reading classic authors is very important, right, for your student life, right, because just like forces you to think, and even if it forces you to think a little more, that's very very important for intellectual development. So if you can do that now, it'll. I think it's just like it'll make you a more mature person, generally speaking. So it's just a good thing to do as an exercise.
Well, anyone else have any thoughts?
Hi, Gurmat, how are you?
Hi, Diksha. What's up? How are you? Long time.
I'm good too. Yeah, I was listening to you talk and it was very interesting. And I haven't read Plato, but I think we're doing it next semester. But and then how we talked about democracy and then how the political situation in the world right now is going on. And I was in my head thinking for a couple of days, being quite critical about democracy. And it's a very simple argument. Sometimes things don't click. The fact that you mentioned that Plato said, well, just because it's a democracy and majority say something doesn't doesn't always mean that it's a right thing. If one person is right and majority do not agree to it, it's something we miss so much. But then if you look at the political situation, that's such a that was something not in my head. And then when you said it was quite it just clicked, and it
Yeah.
really stuck with me. So yeah, so interesting how it comes back from there.
Yeah.
If back from the Greek, because we, at least me being a literature student, we read a lot of Greek literature going back to Ovid and all of that, right?
Yeah.
So it was a very interesting talk. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Well, I must like emphasize on this point. So maybe I think I sort of misspoke on this point, but maybe it's just not that one person has the truth, right? The point there is one person has knowledge, right? So the
Yeah.
Greek word is arete, is like an expertise. So if somebody has so the example that Plato gives throughout his dialogues is that if somebody, for example, has an expertise in carpentry, right? So
Mm.
you have a technical skill on how to build a chair, and if you
Mhm.
gather 100 people in a room who don't have that technical skill, they won't be able to build a chair,
Yeah.
right? That's what
Mhm.
matters. So therefore, when it comes to the question of building a chair, you have to consult a carpenter, like 100 people in a crowd. And so the point there is that politics is also a craft, right? It's a technical skill,
Mm.
and that's the 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 process through which Plato sort of approaches the question of political arrangements. And frankly, I'll be very honest. Like, even though his critique is very like, I think it's very tempting, but I would
Mhm.
like warn you that his alternative is very bad. Like, it's a dystopian form of what we would call like a dictatorship, right?
Oh, okay.
And
Okay.
you won't want to live in that. I'll tell you. Where
Is like the George? Is it like the George Orwell
yeah, basically, it's
1987?
even
Yeah.
worse than that.
Mhm.
It's a way
Mm.
worse. So if you read The Republic, for example, it's like I
Mhm.
used to also read in Ashoka,
Mm.
when you do the Western political thought course. So his like
Mhm.
one of his like prescriptions is you build a state where like babies are taken up,
Mhm.
right? And there's no like parenting and stuff. They're just like divided into different categories. And
Oh,
there's separate, so like there's stuff going on there. Right? There's no
yeah.
type so it's just like a bad
Mm.
place to live in. So it's just like his prescription is really bad. So
Mm.
even though like we be tempted to succumb to his like critique of democracy and just call it, what nonsense is this majority, who cares?
Okay.
The
Mm.
alternative is like is like a nightmare, it's just hell. So let me also like warn everybody
Mhm.
here that just don't like fall into like the trap of being a platonic critique of democracy.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. That's very insightful. I'm excited
Yeah.
now. I'm very excited to read. Plato now. Because I think I'm doing it next semester. So it's very,
Ah, that's
thank you for
fantastic.
this talk.
Oh, I know.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's really cool. Like, everything goes back to Greece. Everything goes back to like like we're talking about like even I'm studying international relations. We're talking about Thucydides. We're talking about the
Yeah,
in war. We're talking about what Sparta did to Athens, and then realism is coming from back then. The foundations of our thinking.
Yeah,
Uh,
Renaissance, all of it. It's very
everything just comes back
interesting.
from like there's no
yeah,
subject that we can go back to Greece and then talk about it right now. It's really very very important to read this stuff. I feel.
yeah. I mean, I just it's very rare in the course of human history that one sort of society can
Mm.
leap so much forward, right?
Yeah.
Like there are moments in India's history that like not India, like generally South Asian history that we also were able to do that. And like in those moments, what's produced is like this magical, right? So it's like it's basically what you could call like a treasure of civilization. So this is one of that. It's just and again, Thucydides, for example, or Herodotus for that matter, right? The word we history as a discipline again, comes from there. What we call international relations strategy comes from there. So just like everything, what we take for granted now as these divided disciplines or subjects. I mean, they were basically, probed by these people.
Yeah.
It's very interesting to, go back to that era and do that. And by the way, let me also say that look, my what I work here is not on this. So, I'm working on very like contemporary things, like political parties and stuff. So this is just like foregrounded to everything else. So I'm not like in classes. I don't work on ancient sort of languages or Plato or Aristotle. But it's very important to know these things.
For sure, for sure. Well, if nobody else has any questions, I think we can wrap up and
Yep.
I'll go home. We'll share this recording with everybody else who's missed it, and we'll also make like reels about maybe like snippets of what Gurmat was saying, and we'll share those with other students, uh, to get the message across, and to tell people about what we're up to and what we're talking about. Anyone, anything? No. Okay, fine. Let's end there. I'll stop the recording. And thank you so much, Gurmat, for doing this. This was really, really helpful.